arrogance, deception, and a dramatic fall from grace. This is the gripping story of Leonard Callahan, a man whose unimaginable wealth could not shield him from the unrelenting hand of justice. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with murmurs like a hive of restless bees. Tension hung in the air as every pair of eyes turned toward the defendant's table. People crowded the benches, shoulder to shoulder, their gazes filled with curiosity and anticipation. Whispers floated from one person to another, each rumor growing more sensational than the last. And then Leonard Callahan entered, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a charcoal gray designer's suit. He walked in with an air of overconfidence, bordering on arrogance. His slicked-back hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the smirk on his face suggested that the room was gathered not to judge him, but to admire him. Leonard Callahan, a name splashed across headlines for weeks, didn't resemble a man accused of stealing millions from struggling families. He looked more like an honored guest than a defendant. But this was only the beginning. Justice was about to catch up with Leonard, and he was about to face something he never imagined he would. The courtroom doors swung open, and Leonard Callahan stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded an air of confidence. His charcoal gray designer suit, expertly tailored, added to his commanding presence. His polished shoes echoed across the marble floor with each deliberate step, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Leonard swept his gaze across the crowd, his smug grin growing wider with every glance. It was as if he believed the courtroom had transformed into his personal stage, and he was the star of the show. The low murmurs that filled the room moments before suddenly ceased, and all eyes turned toward the man who had shaken an entire community. His slick-back hair glistened under the fluorescent lights, and every movement he made radiated arrogance. It was as if he were silently declaring, "I'm not here to be judged. I'm Leonard Callahan." But as his gaze swept over the gallery, Leonard couldn't ignore the familiar faces staring back at him. His victims. They didn't look at him with fear or respect this time. Their eyes were filled with anger and a longing for justice. Judge Elaine Harper entered moments later. Draped in her signature black robe, she moved with a quiet authority. She didn't need to raise her voice or make grand gestures to command respect. Her presence alone demanded it. "All rise for Judge Elaine Harper," the bailiff announced. Everyone rose to their feet. Everyone except Leonard. He remained seated, casually flipping through a notepad as though the proceedings were of little consequence. Leonard Callahan wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of rich that made headlines. Luxury yachts, multi-million-dollar mansions on both coasts, private jets, and extravagant parties rivaling those of Hollywood's elite. His financial empire, Callahan Enterprises, was once hailed as a symbol of innovation and success. But behind the glitz and glamour lay a much darker truth. Leonard's rise to the top was built on deception and insatiable greed. Callahan Enterprises wasn't the golden investment opportunity it was made out to be. Instead, it was a sophisticated scam targeting small business owners and middle-class families. Leonard promised enticing rewards, a secure financial future, a chance to double or even triple investments. Hopeful families trusted him. They drained their savings, sold assets, even mortgaged their homes, all to invest in what they thought was a dream. But when the truth came to light, that dream quickly turned into a nightmare. Retirement accounts, college funds, even entire family inheritances, gone in the blink of an eye. Hundreds of families were left destitute overnight. Once thriving neighborhoods were littered with "for sale" signs. Parents faced the heartbreak of pulling their children out of college because they could no longer afford tuition. To Leonard Callahan, though, it was just business. He didn't see the human cost of his actions. To him, those losses were just numbers on a ledger, nothing more. The trial of Leonard Callahan had officially begun. From the very first moments, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Victims sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes brimming with a mix of hope and anger. In the back rows, reporters scribbled furiously, ready to broadcast every detail to the public. Among the victims was Maria Lopez, a single mother. She once had a modest home and a small savings account meant for her two children's future, but after investing everything in Callahan Enterprises, Maria lost her home and was forced to live in her car with her kids for 2 weeks. Sitting beside her was James Carter, a retired firefighter who had dedicated 35 years of his life to saving others. He had carefully saved enough for a comfortable retirement, only to find himself living in his brother's spare room. As witnesses began to share their stories, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Maria broke into tears as she recounted the day she received the foreclosure notice on her home. Her voice cracked as she said, "I begged them, I pleaded on my knees, but they didn't care," Maria said, her voice breaking. "My kids cried themselves to sleep in the backseat of our car for 2 weeks. Do you know what it feels like to watch your children suffer and not be able to help them?" James Carter's testimony was equally heart-wrenching. His voice trembled with anger as he said, "I spent 35 years running into burning buildings to save lives, but this man, he burned my future to the ground without a second thought." While the courtroom was gripped by the emotional accounts of the victims, Leonard Callahan sat back in his chair, completely unbothered. He scrolled on his phone, leaned over to whisper something to his attorney, and occasionally chuckled under his breath. To Leonard, this wasn't a trial, it was a performance, and he still believed he was the star. But Judge Elaine Harper wasn't swayed by his antics. Her stern gaze followed Leonard's every move. She knew his arrogance would soon meet the unyielding force of truth and justice. On the third day of the trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier as the prosecution began presenting the most damning evidence against Leonard Callahan. At the center of this evidence was a series of internal emails from Callahan Enterprises. The prosecutor stepped forward, holding a stack of documents, her eyes scanning the room before she began reading. One of the most incriminating emails contained a direct order from Leonard himself. "Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line." The courtroom fell silent. Those words, written by Leonard, hung in the air like toxic smoke, suffocating any attempt at defense. In the front row, Maria Lopez shook her head in disbelief. James Carter clenched his fists tightly, his gaze fixed on Leonard. The prosecutor turned toward Leonard, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Mr. Callahan, do you recognize this email?" Before Leonard could respond, his lawyer stood up, objecting. "Objection, this question has already been addressed in pre-trial hearings." But Judge Elaine Harper was unfazed. She raised a hand, her voice calm but firm. "Overruled. The defendant will answer the question." Leonard leaned into the microphone, his face dripping with condescension. With a shrug, he replied, "Yes, I recognize it," Leonard said with a dismissive shrug. "But come on, let's not overdramatize it. It's just business jargon. You wouldn't get it." His words were like gasoline on a fire. The courtroom erupted in whispers, the victims' faces turning red with anger. Judge Harper quickly struck her gavel. "Order in the court." Her steely gaze turned back to Leonard, carrying a quiet but powerful fury. "Mr. Callahan, I advise you to watch your tone. This is not a boardroom meeting." Leonard sat up straighter, still smirking, but the judge's words had left a subtle mark. For the first time, he realized that not everyone could be intimidated or swayed by his wealth and arrogance. On the final day of the trial, the courtroom was electric with anticipation as Judge Elaine Harper ascended the bench to deliver her verdict. Leonard Callahan sat at the defendant's table, initially wearing his trademark smirk. He leaned back in his chair, as if the sentence was nothing more than a formality. Judge Harper began, her voice steady and authoritative. "As you two, Mr. Callahan, you have been found guilty on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the testimonies of your victims paint an undeniable picture of your actions. You manipulated, exploited, and destroyed countless lives, all for personal gain." Leonard's confident facade cracked. His fingers gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and his once arrogant eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Throughout this trial, Judge Harper continued, her tone growing colder, you have shown a blatant lack of remorse. Your behavior in this courtroom has been disgraceful. You insulted your victims, disregarded this court's authority, and acted as if these proceedings were beneath you. Leonard sat upright, his expression shifting from smug to unsettled. The smirk was gone, replaced by a furrowed brow and a flicker of apprehension. Therefore, Judge Harper declared, her voice unwavering, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. A collective gasp swept through the audience. Leonard's face went pale. He shot to his feet, his voice trembling with rage. You can't do this. I'm Leonard Callahan. This is a joke. I'll appeal. Despite Leonard's outburst, Judge Harper remained composed. Bailiff, escort the defendant out of the courtroom. As two officers moved to take Leonard away, he continued shouting, but his voice grew fainter as the doors closed behind him. The courtroom erupted into applause. Maria Lopez buried her face in her hands, sobbing with relief, while James Carter leaned back in his seat, his eyes reflecting a deep sense of peace. Judge Harper addressed the room, her voice firm yet meaningful. Justice has been served. Let this be a reminder that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, is above the law. Judge Harper's final verdict brought an end to one of the most contentious trials in recent memory, but the ripple effects of the case would be felt for a long time. In the immediate aftermath, victims began processing their mixed emotions. Some, like Maria Lopez, expressed relief when speaking to reporters outside the courtroom. I feel relieved that he's finally being held accountable, but the truth is, no sentence can undo the damage he caused. We're still trying to rebuild our lives. Thanks to Judge Harper's order to liquidate Leonard's assets to compensate the victims, Maria was able to secure a new home. Yet the emotional scars her children endured remained a painful reminder of the ordeal. James Carter, who had lost his entire life savings after 35 years as a firefighter, saw the verdict as a victory that extended beyond himself. It's not just about the 25 years he's getting, James told a friend after the trial. It's about sending a message that people like him aren't untouchable. Leonard Callahan's story sparked a nationwide conversation. People began sharing their own experiences of injustice and corruption, seeing the verdict as a reminder that justice, though slow, can still prevail. Among the victims, the most touching response came from Maria's youngest daughter, Sophia. She wrote a letter to Judge Harper that was later published in a local newspaper. The letter read, "Thank you for standing up for my family. Thank you for showing us that people like Leonard Callahan can't get away with hurting people like us. You didn't just give us justice, you gave us a chance to start over." The Callahan case became a symbol of perseverance and collective strength, but for victims like Maria, James, and many others, it was only the beginning. The scars Leonard left behind would take a long time to heal. The story of Leonard Callahan is not just a tale of fraud. It's a profound reminder of what accountability and justice truly mean. For people like Maria Lopez, James Carter, and the hundreds of other victims, Judge Harper's verdict offered a glimmer of hope. But none of them were under the illusion that their losses could ever be fully repaired. The damage Leonard inflicted had etched itself into their lives, serving as a daily reminder of how one person's greed and selfishness could destroy the futures of so many. On a broader scale, this case sparked a societal awakening. It raised pressing questions about ethical responsibility and transparency in the world of business. More importantly, it proved that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, is above the law. In the weeks following the verdict, this story became a rallying cry for those fighting for justice. Victims like Maria and James were no longer just people who had suffered. They became symbols of resilience and perseverance. But perhaps the greatest lesson came from Sophia, Maria's youngest daughter, in her poignant letter. Justice is not just the responsibility of the courts. It's something we all have to fight for every day. The question remains, where does accountability fit into our own lives? How can we ensure that fairness and integrity are not just ideals, but actions? The story of Leonard Callahan doesn't end with a prison sentence. It opens a larger conversation about change and personal responsibility, and like all stories of justice, it leaves behind a simple but powerful message. Justice is not a gift, it's a victory earned through relentless effort. And as long as we keep fighting for what is right, justice will always prevail.